Hello, everybody. Ian Barkin here, yet again with you on yet another episode of One Take Live. Thank you so much for joining us. First and foremost, I hope everyone who is tuning in now or in the future is staying healthy and well. Please take care of yourself. It is still 2020 out there. Um, Want to also call your attention to, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the Sykes Quarterly. We have issue 3 out of Sykes Quarterly, in which we talk about not new normal, because new is just new, but better. Better is better. And so we talk about the better normal, hashtag better normal. And that is a topic that actually my next guest is perfectly placed to talk about. I am so excited about this show. This gentleman is very busy for very good reason, and has now been able to join us to talk about his career and his research and the advice that he's helping leading enterprises give to help them transform. So without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome Tony Saldanha to OneTAKE Live. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ian. Glad to be here.
It is great to have you here. So Tony, this is the part of the show where I ask our guest to introduce themselves. You have had an extraordinary career at an extraordinary company that has then given you a lot of great anecdote and experience that you share with us in something we'll talk about in a moment. But can you give us some background? What did you go to school for? What did you want to do? And then walk us through I think it was a 27-year career at P&G.
Yes, 27 years at Procter & Gamble and 35 years in total. But, it really depends on how far back you want me to go. Growing up, I wanted to be a truck driver. Hey, there's nothing more exciting than having a big rig of your own and being on the road. Somewhere down the line, my parents were able to kind of, argue me out of that. But eventually, I did get a degree in mechanical engineering, again, only to find out that it involved working in, often hot and dusty and dirty factories. And then I said, no, maybe not. And then after an MBA, I ended up in IT.
Okay.
And so I worked for a few years in the US and then back in India, and eventually ended up joining Procter & Gamble in India. And, P&G has been, as you correctly point out, not just a great company, but a great training ground for me. In my career, I've had the opportunity of not just living and working in 6 different countries all over the world, but almost growing up with the latest trends in the IT space. So when I was in the Philippines in early 1992, 93, I set up the first ever global offshore center. And then back here in Cincinnati, in 2003, I was associated with, maybe kind of triggering the outsourcing trend for the industry. I was program leader for the global outsourcing of Procter & Gamble with HP. And that was about a 10-year, $8 billion deal. And then, a few other roles here and there. I was the interim CIO of the Gillette company when P&G acquired Gillette in 2005 in Boston. And then I ran operations in IT and global business services all over the world. Before, quote unquote, retiring from P&G 2 years ago, which brings us right back here. Today, I work with mostly Fortune 100 companies, advising them on digital strategy and global business services strategy.
That's amazing. And so, first of all, inspirational, but so important too, just that you've seen and, as you said, and shaped some of the foundational elements of just the services world, global business services, outsourcing, et cetera. Before we get on to some of those more current projects, I have to ask you this, and I'll give you some background as to why. I was many moons ago, I was in school in London, and I had a friend who was one of the smartest people I know, and she took a job at Procter & Gamble. And she would stand me in front of display windows at stores and point out the products that she was associated with. And And it was the first time I was ever really exposed to just an absolute passion and connection with a product. And, relatively straightforward products that I was just used to always being there on the shelves because everyone interacts with Procter and Gamble in some way, shape, or form in their lives. So inspired by that friend and her walking me through the things that she touched and was excited about, I have to ask you, what has been your favorite Procter and Gamble product?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt about it. It's basically Tide. The laundry liquid.
Okay.
Again, just to be extremely clear, not that I do the laundry in our house, but as a consumer.
That was a self-preservation caveat you got put in there.
Yes,
Very
yes.
good.
No, I'd have to live that one down with the rest of my family forever. But the fact of the matter is, not only is it a fantastic product, but the way that they keep innovating what really should have been a commodity product a long time ago. I mean, there's no reason why, laundry isn't, commodity, which means the lowest price wins, but a combination of capabilities as well as innovations, like pods and then, beads and all that kind of stuff. And not just help me because, of course, my clothes look newer or neater, but there is an element of pride in the whole story there.
Yeah. See, there it is. I again, and in various different roles that I've played in outsourcing, where I've worked with a client that is more of a product company than a services company. It's just so intriguing to me to see the level of association and pride they have, and your pride is with Tide. So that rhymes, which is
and that is true. And by the way, this is almost like an obsession with most Procter and Gamble families. I mean, if you are ever caught with a competitive product in your home, God help. I mean, of course, nothing happens. It's all fun and all that kind of stuff.
No,
but the red face that you end up with as a result of that is really funny.
Oh, I can imagine. Okay, so thank you for indulging me on that particular question. So, as you said, now, so you don't seem to retire well. So you've jumped into entrepreneurship. You have founded Tranformant, where you're helping leading enterprises understand transformation. Let's get to that in a moment. But you've also founded, effectively, it's an industry forum called Inixia. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so Inixia is an idea that we think whose time had come many years ago. But here's a little bit of background for what exactly is Inixia, and then what is shared services, global business services. In most companies, when you're looking to drive productivity in internal operations like finance or IT or HR or whatever it is, the best strategies are simplification, standardization, and then automation. And then what you do is then you start to look at scale, right? So if I'm doing payroll in division 1 of the company and there's about 5 of them, why don't I do payroll together for all 5, right?
Right.
And so that's really what led to the construct of shared services, which is you share the services. But then over a period of time, that's become more and more sophisticated through things like outsourcing and offshoring, and then artificial intelligence automation and complete process re-engineering. But it's actually an interesting problem, because this industry, which is going to be $100 billion very shortly,
right,
has no standards, right? So if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, there are standard educations, there are standards for how you do your profession. Mm-hmm. Well, as it turns out, GBS has none. It's basically a homegrown industry because, quite honestly, that's how it grows in the company. You take bits and pieces of functions and you put them together into an organization, and you say, congratulations, you are now global business services. So after I left P&G, I kept getting sucked into these advisory arrangements, and I kept giving people the same story again and again of, oh, no, this is the right way to do it. There is a method to the madness. And eventually, one of my bosses, a guy named Filippo Passerini, from Procter & Gamble, who actually coined the term GBS, Global Business Services, and we got together and said, this is madness, let's just bring the industry together and create the standards and then certification and training. So therefore, Inixia.
That's tremendous. No, it's a great backstory, and clearly, as you said, needed because my career has been spent in the same space, and it's got a lot of people who are just like your pride in Tide. There are people who are very proud of global business services and outsourcing and shared services, and I'm sure are thrilled with the work you're doing and the direction you're going with it. So let's pivot, because as you say, there needs to be sort of a better way to do things and standards and processes. We're going to start with the vocabulary, I guess, foundation setting, and then we're going to talk about digital transformation, because that's really the area that you've carved out for yourself recently, and it's what you help enterprises to try to shape and to achieve. But before we define digital transformation, there's a word that's used in that definition where you refer to the fourth industrial revolution. So can you start us off there? What do you mean by the fourth industrial revolution?
Again, the fourth industrial revolution is how digital technology is pretty much eating away and disrupting every other technology. Physical technology, like the Internet of Things, machinery, biological technology, all of the cool stuff that Elon Musk is doing, and with, implanting chips in brains, but, even more tactically, things like genomics or even mRNA. That's our best hope right now for a COVID vaccine. That's almost here. And then also social technology, Facebook and WeChat and so on and so forth. Now, most people, kind of intuitively understand that the world around us is being disrupted, and that it is this digital technology that seems to be changing everything around us, right? But thinking about it in the context of an industrial revolution is what the World Economic Forum started to do, a few years ago. And I think that is the only, sane explanation for what's happening around us. And it also gives us great lessons for how we can live with it and actually thrive in it. See, the first, second, and third industrial revolutions got into steam, electric, and internet technologies. And they were not just technical revolutions, they were human revolutions, whether it was the hunger that was caused in the original industrial revolution, when people had to leave their farms and come into the city, or whether it is the major changes that the internet has brought, including the .com, the bust of a lot of companies, changing business models, so on and so forth. So for me, this then became a very important lens with which to view the term digital disruption and therefore digital transformation.
Perfect. Now, great background. So, okay, so that leads us to our next question, and you allude to this, and I've struggled with this too. Digital transformation is used everywhere now. It is one of the most ubiquitous things in business. Everyone suggests that they're doing it or they're trying to, but everyone appears to have a different understanding of what it is. So we ask an expert, what to you does digital transformation mean?
So picking off of the explanation of what the fourth industrial revolution. So fourth industrial revolution equals digital disruption, right? This is the only thing that makes sense to me. Therefore, digital transformation is the rewiring of enterprises, governments, people, processes, and systems, so that those entities that exist in the third industrial revolution era, which is kind of now somewhere in between, can successfully migrate to and survive that fourth industrial revolution, right? For me, that's digital transformation, right? Okay. At a very, very high level. And then you kind of go down, and I will break this down further. Digital transformation is, especially in the context of companies in the corporate world, It is the rewiring of complete new business model. So if you happen to be in the brick and mortar retail business, it's maybe brick and mortar and online, because you cannot ignore online, or maybe eventually migrating completely to online. That's a completely new business model. So that's one of three. The second part is migrating from regular products to smart products. So think in terms of regular cars to smart cars. In the case of Procter & Gamble, regular toothbrushes to smart toothbrushes that can now tell you if you missed a tooth in brushing, right?
Right.
So that's the second thing, smart products. And the third, which is really where my experience is the most, is internal business operations. So, we in the corporate world, we do things a certain way, right? Whether it is accounting, whether it is payroll, whether it is logistics, supply chain transformation. We know that our startup competitors do this extremely differently, and in many cases, twice as more effectively and 10 times faster. So it is that rewiring of those large company processes so that we can effectively compete with the agility and the cost structure of a startup. That's the next generation internal business model. So digital transformation is rewiring for the fourth industrial revolution. And then what it means in real practical terms is one or two or more of these three things that I just talked about.
Perfect. So before we pivot to my next question, I do want to take a break to just welcome the guests that have joined us and thank them and encourage them to ask questions. We've got people from all over the world. We've got Jeriel from Chapel Hill. So Jeriel, thank you so much for joining us. Matt Sullivan from Boston. Shay also from Boston. Keith from Durham, North Carolina. We've got AJ Indianapolis, Brianna from Tampa. Hope it's warm there because I'll be back soon. Sarah Grace from Portland. We've got Gloria from El Salvador. We've got Anish, who just passed a question through from India. Anish, thank you for joining us. And yes, Anish asks, can we share the do's and don'ts when starting with digital transformation for any business? Absolutely. We will dedicate the rest of the show to exactly that. So you can let us know, Anish, at the end if we've done our jobs. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. So, okay, so Tony, digital transformation, everyone's talking about it. You've defined it. That's very helpful. For a while, I've had the sense that it's just not going as well as people hoped it would. They seem to be struggling with it, whatever they defined it to be. And then analysts started to jump on board, and there's all sorts of research that suggests some sort of paltry percentage of attempts are actually succeeding. And then, not just that, someone wrote a book about it. And
I recognize that.
Right. So that book is, for those who are interested, Why Digital Transformations Fail. It was written by my guest. So it's failing so much that it was worth your time to document what's going on here. So get us started. Why is this so hard? What's happening in enterprises that they're failing enough for us all to be talking more about the struggle in some cases than the mission?
Yeah, and connecting this question from the previous one,
right.
It's failing at a really, really critical time. So when you kind of think about us being in the fourth industrial revolution, this isn't a time to have a big failure rate, right? And yet 70% of all digital transformations fail. Yeah. That's a horrible, horrible number, given the importance of, gosh, we're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution. We better succeed, right? So that's terrible. The second thing is that it's also a really big industry. It's a $2 trillion industry as of 2020, right? No other industry would accept a 70% failure rate. Mm-hmm. That's so impactful to what's happening around us. So back to your question, why do 70% of digital transformations fail? I'll start with the simple but somewhat facetious answer. I take this back to Alice in Wonderland, right? So this is in the book where Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, hey, which way should I go? And the cat says, well, it depends on where you want to get to. Alice says, I don't care. And then the Cheshire Cat says, well, that doesn't matter which way you go, right? That's issue number one with digital transformation. If you cannot define it precisely, you are going to fail, right? Don't get me wrong. You may have a successful pilot. You may even have a successful rollout of technology. But against the goal of transforming yourself to survive and thrive in an industrial revolution, you will fail, right? So that's issue number one, definition, right? And I will get back to definition later again. The second is, even when you define it, and this is the second reason why digital transformations fail, it is disciplined execution and using the right processes to execute. So this is what happens. Digital technology is equated to IT and IT technology. Therefore, digital transformation projects all use IT project management processes to make things successful. Well, the only problem is that these aren't IT projects. These are people changes, rewiring business models, high risk, high return investments, and so on and so forth. Right. And normal IT project management methodology actually is insufficient. It has to be complemented with two other disciplines. One is organizational change, right? We know that's really where most of the 90% of the failures in digital transformation are due to organizational change. And then the second is, for a certain percentage of your change, you have to think disruptive, and driving disruptive projects means you have to drive them as a portfolio of ideas, where for every 10 ideas, just like with a venture capitalist, maybe 9 of them are going to fail, but the 10th one is going to be $1 billion idea. Those two methodologies need to be woven into the discipline of execution. So that's it, right? Define it correctly and use the right execution methodology.
Outstanding. So I'll take it in reverse order, because I do want to get back to definition as you referred to too, and you've got some great frameworks. And I actually want to flip it now, because you have declared, and it's clear that this is happening, that enterprises just aren't achieving what they're setting out to achieve, whatever it might be. To the Alice in Wonderland analogy, they know they want to get someplace. They can't necessarily well define it, but they certainly know they're not there. Yes. But the venture capital portfolio concept, I mean, venture capitalists are very comfortable with failure, because they know that there's a percentage, it's a percentage game, right? And so they're hoping that a few really, really succeed. Is it a battle war thing where right now venture capitalists win the war, that just some of the battles they don't necessarily win, because some of them end up having high returns? It's a strange analogy to use, war and then returns, but anyway. But right now we're just seeing a lot of enterprises apparently losing both the battle and the war. Enough of the incremental investments they're making fail that the overall mission is also failing. You do a great job in the book of highlighting how at Procter & Gamble you set up an entire format and methodology and math around the sorts of investments you're making and what you're comfortable calling success and identifying rapidly as failure and moving on from it. Can you share some of that math and the structure you put in place?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to, Ian. And all of this, just to kind of ground ourselves, is in the space of the transformation or disruptive part of your portfolio, right? There's always 3 parts of your business: the day-to-day operations, the continuous improvement, and this is the third part, which is what most organizations don't do or don't do well. Now, in that third part, which is the equivalent of a Google X or a real disruptive, innovative, upstream innovative idea, the trick is to basically sort through tons and tons of potential disruptive ideas, and then to make some of them successful, and to be perfectly fine killing most of them. To your point, Ian, this is really also the issue of battles versus wars, which is we have to be okay, with a lot of quote unquote losses, right? Battles lost, so that you can essentially get to that one big successful idea. So Google X, now Alphabet, they get thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ideas on what they could do. they funnel only about 30 of them into 10x, just 10x meaning 10 times bigger, disruptive innovation kind of projects, which are what Google X, the organization that gave us driverless cars and stuff like that, this is what they work on, right? So it's all about, they consider themselves an idea killing machine. And so that's what we set out to be at Procter & Gamble within the space of global business services. And the math is very, very simple. So when you kind of think of your company portfolio, Google's percentage is 70% on day-to-day operations, 20% on continuous improvement, 10% on disrupt yourself. Well, we're not a tech company. So in our case, it was probably more like 80 and then 19 and a half and a 0.5, but it doesn't matter. The 0.5 is really important. The second thing is then you look at pain points, really, really big issues that are at least a certain, size of price. In our case, if it was less than a $50 million idea, I was not interested, right? Okay. And then what you do is for every 10 of those projects that you kick off, there is a formula that we kind of came up with, which is called 10-5-4-1. For every 10 of those ideas, the team that worked on it would actually volunteer to kill half of those if they didn't, I did. And of the remaining 5, maybe 4 of them or 3 of them might turn out to be a 2x. So double the ROI or 3 times the ROI, not 10. And we said, fine, we need some of those. But then one of them would turn out to be a 10x, right? And then when you look as a venture capital at the entire math, it's like, oh, I could kill as many as I want in order to get to, a few $100 million every year. And so that's the math there.
Right. Now thank you for walking us through that, because I think most enterprises struggle to approach their innovation in such a methodical way, and really wrap a model around it, and therefore it's sort of directionally it's aspirational, but the journey isn't as structured. And so I think that's one of the great resources that your book provides is effectively a tool set and also kind of a roadmap. So that's the next topic is you lay out effectively what you call 5 stages of digital transformation for an organization, a maturity model, if you will. Can you walk us through those 5 stages?
Yes, absolutely. And the context for the 5 stages was, we talked about everybody's got their own definition of digital transformation, and at the end of the day, I'm a realist. I might have my own definition, but the world isn't necessarily going to adopt my definition. It's going to be, one of a billion definitions out there in the world. And so the next best thing was to figure out how we can qualify that definition through some kind of a stage model, and therefore the 5-stage model. So stage 1 is what I call foundation. It is quite literally what most people out there think is digital transformation, but it is not. Foundation is automating stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're implementing the next SAP, or if you're taking your sales processes and figuring out how to digitize it, or, as most people think these days with COVID, if you're doing, video conferencing using Zoom, they think, oh, the world is transformed. That's digital transformation. It is not. It is actually not even transformative. It is digitization. It's taking the physical and non-electronic and turning it into electronic stuff. Right.
Right. I mean, others, I don't take credit for this, it's an old saying, but effectively paving cow paths, you're just emulating the old way of doing things, and as you said, just automating it, doing a digital version of the manual predecessor.
Exactly. But it has an important role to play in the sense that, turning stuff into bits and bytes, into digits, is an important foundation for what's to come next, which are new business models. Stage 2 is then what I call is siloed digital transformation. This is where in a company or in a division or maybe even in a country, you see parts of organization and parts of leaders who start to worry about, hey, all of this digitization and continuous improvement isn't going to cut it. So I need to then have a portfolio of disruptive ideas, right? So it could be the finance manager who's saying, hey, I need to try and look at how I do intra-company transfers, not using regular processes, but maybe using blockchain. Or, the outsourcing manager that starts to say, well, wait a minute, isn't there a different process and technology role that allows, the entire organization to free itself up from the way we've been doing outsourcing? But by nature, it's siloed, right? So that's the issue, which is it's not company-wide. Stage 3 starts to get to company-wide, but I call it partially synchronized. This is where I think General Electric was under Jeff Immelt when they said, we want to be a data company. They set a top-down goal. They absolutely were very clear on their end objectives, but execution was not completely synchronized, right? And I think GE, by the way, I give them a lot of credit. They shared a lot of learnings with the rest of the world. But that's what happens when, in reality, the reward systems of the different organizations and the synchronization of efforts it doesn't happen.
Right.
Stage 4 is, sorry.
Just quickly, as far as the siloed and the partially synchronized, that, as you mentioned, there's sort of a top down, and that's I think where you're going. But ultimately, that stage 2 and stage 3 sound to me like they're really energized, effectively entrepreneurs who see opportunities, are trying to champion them, but doing so in the realm that they have some sphere of influence over. Is that fair to say? There's that innovator in some part of your back office who's just real keen to try something shiny and new, and maybe is onto something.
That's very insightful. That's exactly spot on. Of course, it's more prominent in stage 2, where you've got these silos and almost like skunk work operations.
Yeah.
Stage 3, they have a little bit of air cover because the CEO is saying, we want to do this.
Got it.
But it is still not. It's still more intrapreneurial, and it is still not bold enough, and it's certainly not synchronized. In terms of the magnitude across various divisions, which really gets us to stage 4, which is fully synchronized. And this is really where the company essentially achieves one-time digital transformation, right? So everything kicks in, and they change their business model, they change their internal business operations, and if relevant, they even have some smart products, right? So they start to win in the marketplace. They start to beat their competition. But, as we said earlier, there is a 5th stage. So there's got to be something missing. And that missing ingredient is repeatability. We know the disciplines of perpetually winning organizations is that they have a DNA of self-disruption. Netflix was able to disrupt its own business model 3 times, from mail and DVD to original content, to streaming video, to original content, and now international business models. And so the 5th stage is what I call the DNA, the living DNA of the organization.
Right.
And that's where the reward systems and the organization culture basically is one of self-disruption. They're always looking to disrupt themselves, not just their competition.
Right. That's can't help but think of the example you set out with Tide, and the fact that P&G perpetually transformed and innovated and cannibalized the traditional market and the traditional delivery mechanism of Tide as a liquid. I had no idea we were going to talk this much about laundry in this interview. So this is and I do have to qualify too, for my own safety in the future, that I'm not as helpful as I should be in my own family laundry situation. So living DNA is this thrilling concept of sort of the ultimate vision, the fantasy of companies being able to be agile and perpetually innovating and challenging itself. Some companies are able to do that. Other companies, I imagine the ones that you spend a lot of time advising, are big, which means they've been around a while, and thus their DNA is perhaps quite different. So how do you change a DNA to make it digital ready? I mean, as we sort of joked before we went live, what's the sort of stem cell injection you can inject into an enterprise, leadership or otherwise, to make their DNA comfortable with this sort of disruption and transformation in a perpetual manner?
Yeah. As I was saying, Ian, I think you should, before the taping, you should copyright the term stem cell DNA injection into this, because I think it's got an idea that's got different legs, a lot of legs. But kind of going back to how do you drive that change? What's the trigger there? Firstly, it depends a lot on the situation in the company. In many ways, the easiest situation is when that company faces an existential crisis. And then, of course, there is a burning platform, you change a lot of stuff, everybody kind of just rolls with it, and then you get things done, right? But again, companies like Procter & Gamble and others that have been around for, literally more than 100 years, that's not how they change, right? They're much more proactive about it, right? So the proactive approach really kind of gets down to how do you create the organization, as you said, the stem cell cut and paste into the DNA that allows that change to exist and becomes part of the culture. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. One is to strategically create, what we were talking about, the stuff that I did at Procter & Gamble, which is to create what is called an edge organization. And it's called an edge organization because it, quote unquote, resides on the boundaries of the company, almost outside the company and yet owned by the company. Right. And what I mean by that is that it almost operates as if it were a startup, or as a venture capitalist with a whole bunch of startups is a better analogy. It has rewards and recognitions that recognizes that failures in the right way should be rewarded, whereas in the regular organization, if you fail on a project, you should not be rewarded, right? And so that's you've got to square that particular circle, and the way to do that is to create this edge organization. Okay. And so that's one way to do that, which is you build your own edge organization. Another way to do that is to then bring in that edge organization from the outside. So, for example, when Walmart acquired Jet.com, or through an acquisition like that, you're making a strategic acquisition and hoping that snipped in DNA is going to infect the rest of the company. Right. But that's the way to do it. Yeah, those are some of the methodologies.
You'd mentioned existential crisis as one of the sort of burning platforms to force companies to change. I think it's probably not a hard argument to make that 2020 is itself effectively an existential crisis to so many industries and so many companies. Do you think the byproduct of this year will be more companies better prepared to at least embark on that journey to the living DNA stage?
I think it would have accelerated most companies' journeys. There's no doubt about it. And we all know that. I mean, we start to see that there have been some statistics published recently. Depending on the industry, there's been at least anywhere from a 5 to a 22% increase in investment, not necessarily in IT, but in building digital business models and capabilities. So we know that that's been accelerated. Now, the question, though, is whether that acceleration and all of those moves are happening in the right area. So, one of the things over the last couple of months as I've had the opportunity to talk to companies, they keep saying, oh, yes, we've invested in remote working, we've invested in, digitizing workflows, scanning records, cutting down on facilities, using some of that money to actually invest in other stuff. And unfortunately, for the world as it very quickly, hopefully, comes out of the pandemic, that's going to be table stakes. If that's all we have done, then you're going to be at the same level as the rest of the competition. You still have to ask yourself, where is my competitive advantage, right? And where am I going to get ahead? And so many of the disciplines that I lay out in my book, including understand your digital leverage points, are still going to be important, because when the tide has moved all boats, you still have to find a new wave to essentially get on top of the other boats, if you know what I mean. I'm really mangling up the metaphor there.
No.
I think you get the idea.
Mangling analogies is my thing. I love it. So, but that idea that through my lens, what we've worked so hard on the last few months is that migration to work at home, and you nailed it. There's a lot of foundational platform and safety and structure changes that have been made, but it'll become table stakes very quickly if you don't look at what does that set you on the path to achieve.
Yes.
Going forward. You lay out in the book, and we'll put links to the book, by the way, for everyone listening, and encourage everyone to read it. And actually, before I forget, I do want to mention, and I shared this with you before we started, the executive leadership team at Sykes caught wind of the book, have passed it around and love it. Our chief HR officer, a shout out to her, because she raves about it, thinks it's both really well written and a really good resource. And you've got tools in the book that help people to think through the stages, those 5 stages of evolution from the foundational to the living DNA. And you talk about some of the key disciplines or themes that are necessary to progress. And with the time we've got remaining, I'd like to drill down on a few of them. The first one that you state from the foundational step is committed ownership. Share with us what you mean by committed ownership.
Yeah. So the idea kind of goes back to what I was saying. We're in the midst of an industrial revolution, which means essentially the change that's going to be necessary is going to be much bigger, and therefore it's going to need much more help than traditional change, right? Yeah. Just to kind of cite a few examples, when leaders in companies say, hey, we're going to drive digital transformation. In fact, we have invested in it. We put money. We've got a chief digital officer. Right. The first question I kind of go back and ask them is, how is your digital strategy different than your business strategy, right? Because if you think that a digital strategy is something different than your business strategy, then you are essentially not committed to changing your own business model, right? So in other words, companies should not have a digital strategy. Companies should have a business strategy on how they're going to use digital technologies to change the 3 things that I mentioned earlier, which is business models, smarter products, or internal operations, right? And carving them out as separately makes it look to the rest of the organization that the leadership is delegating ownership, right? And that is a mistake. In the midst of an industrial revolution, this is no time to delegate responsibilities. This is the time for the CXO, and more importantly, for the board of directors to educate themselves on the possibilities and to commit, put some skin in the game, commit to Wall Street, commit to your organization that if we are not able to hit X, Y, Z, I'm going to take personal accountability. That's what committed ownership is. Right.
The few different places to go there from the book, but so as you said, it's not a digital strategy. It is strategy, and calling it a digital strategy has probably lent it to be thought of and approached as an IT project, which is, you point out, one of the foundational reasons why all of this is failing at such a colossal rate, because it isn't. The IT project frameworks and methodologies just aren't well suited for this sort of journey that an organization's on.
Correct.
You talk about you Actually, it was fun as I was reading it, because I'm like, that's like the analogy, and then seconds later you nailed it and said it's the pig and the chicken. The chicken's involved, committed,
Yeah.
and so to some degree you're suggesting that the board of directors and the executive suite should be a little bit more like the pig in that analogy.
Yes, absolutely. Pig in the breakfast. They are the ones that get committed, not involved like the chickens laying eggs.
Right. So great segue then into the one of the points that you actually cite as a discipline further up this maturity model, which is really around skills. It's it is not commonly taught in business schools. Certainly wasn't 20, 30 years ago when executives might have been going through them. Just the foundational elements that they need to understand to be digitally literate.
Yeah.
What does it take for a board and an executive suite in any organization to be sufficiently digitally literate?
Yeah, and the starting point is where you see, with the Fortune 500, where they start to introduce roles such as a digital director. Again, I don't like it, but again, like the cut and paste DNA thing, I think maybe it's a starting point, right? And then a study that I think I refer to in my book as well says in the Fortune 500, about 20% of those boards actually have a digital director. Mm-hmm. But then it kind of goes on to say that even with that, only about 5% of those companies actually have the digital literacy that is needed to drive transformation, right?
Right.
And that is a very sobering statistic, because the very strategic direction that needs to come top down, if they aren't completely up to speed on the possibilities, how are they going to set, back to Alice in Wonderland, the goal of where to go, right? And I think that's an issue. Now, but that's only, not to kind of pick on board of directors, but that's only the start of the whole process. We have got a digital literacy gap at the CXO level. We've got a digital literacy gap at the middle of the organization, and fortunately, not much of a digital literacy gap at the bottom of the organization. Given the relatively younger schooling that you have at that level, but you may still have a gap. And so I address that with a few suggestions. One is that leadership of the company, you've got several strategies possible. You don't actually have to go to school, reverse mentoring, but also personally sponsoring small little experiments. When I was an executive at Procter & Gamble, I used to take my leadership team for a visit to some startups, whether in Silicon Valley or New York or whatever it is, every 6 months, to kind of get a sense on how quickly the world is changing around it, and to learn a little more hands-on on applied technology, right? So there are many tools and techniques. With the body of the organization, this has just got to be pure and simple an investment from the company. Amazon a few months ago said they were going to invest $700 million to drive up digital literacy. And you look at Amazon and say, what the heck are you talking about? You're probably the most digital literate company in the world. But they know that that's not good enough, right? And so every company's got to get into that game.
Right. Well, and I think it's in a similar fashion as digital transformation's approached as a technology project, that literacy is approached as a technology degree, and they don't need to know how to code. And in fact, you point out so rightly, and something I've discussed before, is some of the literacy is actually in the more foundational elements like change management communications, and perhaps that's maybe it's not knowledge that's missing, it's just knowledge that needs to be refreshed, just because it hasn't stopped being just critical. It is a key foundation to being literate and capable enough to get to that living DNA stage.
Absolutely.
Tony, want to pivot for a quick question from Anish, because Anish actually asked something that gets back almost to the bottom of the pyramid that you mentioned, which is is digital transformation seen, and a lot of people bring this up, is sort of the fear of job loss. Is it an alternative to humans when it comes to automating tasks? Are we going to be losing good talent in that bottom of the pyramid who we may count on in the sort of the mid to longer term because of their knowledge, but we're replacing them before we can tap into that, or before I guess we can develop them into the leaders we need to run organizations?
Yes. And I really like the way, Anish, you framed it, because there are two related but different issues here. One is, does automation lead to joblessness in society? It's a little bit like there was a study in the 1950s that said that, hey, if we continue to automate, and this was mechanical automation at that stage, by the time we reach the 70s or 80s, people are only going to work 3 days a week or something like that, right? And if anybody is working only 3 days a week today, let me know. If anything, I think we may be working harder. So one is that question of, is this going to be detrimental to mankind in some ways, or better, if you like lying on the beach? But, and the answer to that is, every piece of data that we have and every trend that we see from history says that it doesn't mean that humans are going to be subservient to robots, or we're going to lie on the beach all day, or whatever it is, right? So that's part one. But part two, which is really the part I like even more, was then what happens if you kind of look at the organization pyramid and you have to let go of some people, and they, maybe you shouldn't have let go of them because they're like the experience of the organization that eventually you need to develop to the top. And that's the reality. That's a possibility, unless you have a digital literacy and a digital workforce strategy in the company, right? So what good companies do, and I've worked with MIT on something called the future of work, right? Is that they proactively plan for the disruption of the workforce, right? And that's a real thing, right? Because there are going to be tasks where machines take over, and there's going to be new tasks where you need new people, right? And they don't necessarily equate to the same people. So you may have to actually lose some people here and hire some people there. If you don't do that in a very planned, a strategic way, what you're going to face is all kinds of problems, right? You're going to lose the brains of the company and the history of the company through that process. And the only answer to that is, again, be extremely deliberate in plotting that out ahead of time.
That's tremendous. Tony, we are at the end of our time, and I can't thank you enough. This is a tremendously interesting discussion, informed by a tremendously successful career, and now, as you say, you're not good at taking time off either. So you're I'm sure working tirelessly to help enterprises to figure out what they need to do to really get it right this time, because I feel like digital transformation's been attempted, has been failed at enough times that it's worth writing a book about, and there won't something that we're starting to say is effectively there won't be a third chance at digital transformation. You have to get it right the second time, otherwise you'll lose the rights to take another try at it. And thank you, John F. Kennedy, for giving us the phrase moonshot. But you're not going to be given the air cover or the executive support or the mandate that you call out in your disciplines to make an attempt at that moonshot again. So with that, I will thank you on behalf of all of the listeners of OneTAKE.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
We will share the links to this book. Pick this up. This is the best book I have read on both the real history of and the transformation of services, and a really pragmatic set of tools to examine how your enterprise should embrace digital transformation. So thank you, Tony, so much for your time today. And
I enjoyed it. You're very kind. Thank you very much. Yes.
Great. Great. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.